Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system.
We have a unique but rapidly shrinking window of opportunity to learn lessons and reset ourselves on a more sustainable path. It is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again. So we must use all the levers we have at our disposal, knowing that each and every one of us has a vital role to play.
The Great Reset is a welcome recognition that this human tragedy must be a wake-up call. It is imperative that we reimagine, rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate, and rebalance our world.
In case you've been living in a bunker recently, this is where we're at these days.
Out of this property, you Nazis! Out!
You can call it the New World Order, the Great Reset, Skynet for all I care. Either way, things are getting pretty weird in this post-COVID world.
So please get the vaccine.
Things like freedom of assembly and freedom of worship seem to have become privileges instead of rights. And who gets to decide if, where, and when God's people can gather and worship? You guessed it, Big Brother, who assures us that all this is temporary and for our own good. Of course they would never abuse their newfound powers. They're just keeping us safe. By the way, how has the church responded to all of this?
Don't tell me nothing about the vaccine when I got the vaccine in February and I'm feeling good and I'm fine and you ain't got it.
I am the founder, editor at Cauldron Pool, which is a Christian website for news and opinion pieces. We're largely created because we thought the Christian voice in Australia was so irrelevant and it had been reduced to next to nothing that they've basically been shamed into silence on a lot of cultural, social issues. We needed a platform where Christians could speak, where Christians could confront ideas, where they could counter ideas and ultimately present the gospel to the world. I think we came into our peak during COVID, and I think the reason for that is mainstream media in Australia has largely had one message and one response to COVID, and that is to basically echo everything the government tells them to say. There's a narrative that the mainstream media here are maintaining and very careful to maintain, and there are very few people challenging that. There are very few people speaking against that, and there are very few people providing an alternative. It's been remarkable to see how many Christians there are out there contacting us who feel alienated from their churches, who feel shunned by their churches and rejected by their churches because not only do they not want to hear what they have to say or what they think about the mainstream narrative that's being pushed on the people, but there's really an atmosphere in the church that would cultivate that message from the government, that's wanting to reiterate what the government mandates are, what the government requires of us. Unfortunately, speaking, generally, and in regards to the mainline denominations, the people who present themselves as public Christian figures in Australia, they've all essentially adopted the government's approach. They've all encouraged the church to maintain social distancing, to wear a mask if you want to come to worship, to exclude the unvaccinated from worship when the government says they must be excluded, to check in with the government every time they enter into worship, and to shut down churches when the government says to shut down churches, and to bar singing when the government says to bar singing. So they've really operated as a minor mouthpiece for the government in all of this. It has been one of compliance at every point. There's largely no point at which they have resisted or rejected or challenged anything the government has done or said in response to COVID, no matter how unjust those measures are. There's just been no resistance. The church is terrified by coronavirus, or so they say. But often I think the fears that they propagate and the fear of the virus is often a cover for a fear of the state. There was a group of pastors in Queensland who I was in touch with, and they formed what was called the Ezekiel Declaration. Now, that was an open letter to the Prime Minister in Australia, and it was warning against the dangers of implementing vaccine passports, what it would do to society, what it would do to churches, and the dangers that would be. It would create a two-tiered society, people skeptical of each other. Now, that went viral. We didn't expect it to gain the attraction that it did, but we had, within a matter of weeks, 3,000 church leaders signed that letter. Almost 30,000 church members and attendees signed that letter, and it was widely distributed among the church. Now, it was at this point that, and only at this point, that we've seen the mainline denominations, church leaders, and the institutions make a concerted effort to challenge something. And it wasn't the mandates, it wasn't vaccine passports, it wasn't barring singing or the unvaccinated from entering into worship. It was an effort to prevent people and discourage people from signing this letter. The environment in Australia is that we've been comfortable for so long, we've been prosperous for so long, we've had it easy for so long, that it's cultivated a type of church leader in Australia that is somewhat spineless when it comes to standing for what's right. A lot of the condemnations to the Ezekiel Declaration, for instance, had a lot of bold language about when the government, implements these vaccine passports, we're going to take a stand. We're going to be bold, we're going to be courageous, and we're going to make our voices heard. But when the time came, and I'm talking a week later, the government implemented the vaccine passports, they caved and they said, we're going to comply until the government says otherwise. And that's what we think is the best thing to do. So there's just a culture of weakness in the church, and I think that's because we have not had to flex our muscles in so long. We have not had to resist anything.
One of the things that the gospel brings is freedom. And one of the ways that the gospel brings freedom is through the separation of authorities and powers and spheres. The problem with human beings is that we're fallen. And we're always grasping for that which is not ours. And so what God did was He designed separate governments or separate spheres that operate in their own jurisdictions, so that you have this separation of authorities, separation of powers, a multiplicity of authorities that sometimes overlap or sometimes stack, but allow freedom in those realms. So parents have certain responsibilities that the state does not have. The church has certain responsibilities that neither the family nor the state have. Those responsibilities, kept in their proper jurisdictions, mean that you have this multi-tiered, stacked, sort of functional separation of powers where freedom can operate. And where one of the jurisdictions starts to step out of line, the other jurisdictions can check and balance that first, overstepping jurisdiction. That's a really, really important thing. We see it early on in the scriptures. When Moses, for instance, is attempting to adjudicate all of the needs of the people of Israel, his father-in-law Jethro comes and he says, "What? You can't do this. This is not good for you, and it is not good for this people." And so he established this separation of powers, this jurisdictional structure where there were captains of tens and hundreds and thousands. so that the work could be spread out, but also so that authority could not be centralized, and so that freedom could not be so easily stamped out.
The history of Christian political thought is really the history of the fight against totalitarianism. And it's because of several things, but not the least of them is the doctrine of original sin. Because of original sin, no one can be trusted with absolute power. No institution can be trusted with absolute power. So you must always find ways of limiting the power, because otherwise it will inevitably become corrupt and abusive. In a biblical worldview, God has designated certain people to be authorities, to have authority. He's designated different spheres of life that are to operate autonomously, not under some all-embracing totalitarian style of government. That was what the world was like before Christianity. Christianity is what broke that up.
In terms of the vaccinated economy, to tell you the truth, I'm not 100% clear on what New South Wales' position is, and that might be my fault rather than theirs. Why would you just get the system going? Why would you have the thing up and running and then essentially pull all that down, pull all the architecture that you built, all the infrastructure that you built, the culture that you've changed? Why would you change that 4 or 5 weeks later? We will not be doing that here. If you make the judgment to not get vaccinated and you reckon you can wait out us or the publican or whoever you want to think you're waiting out, you won't wait out the virus, because the virus will be here for a long time, and your only protection against it is being vaccinated. So we've got every reason to be confident, we've got every reason to be optimistic and upbeat. The Victorians have done an amazing job, but that job includes us making some difficult decisions, and that's to keep people who are not vaccinated out of some of those venues that we've been talking about today.
The progressives do have a positive view of the future. This is one of the reasons why progressivism still has a market. Obviously, Marx, Engels, Lenin, they had a strong postmillennial bent, secular of course. And Francis Nigel Lee wrote about a 1,300-page book called Communist Eschatology. And he made it clear that it was the postmillennial vision, secularized, of Marx and Engels and Lenin that was basic to the success of the communist movement. So they have borrowed the postmillennialism of Christianity and have proclaimed that vision as their own, but in a secular framework. And their goal is to use the state as the means of comprehensive redemption. The communists spoke of a new mankind or a new man, a regenerate mankind, and it would be programmed by the state. And there is still that kind of talk, except now we're told that it's going to be the fusion of tremendous improvements of digital technology, implants into the brain, which will lead to a new humanity that will then be able to overcome the effects of sin. Now, the Christian doctrine is very clear. There must be redemption, and it is by grace alone. And it is real. And it is real in eternity, and it is real in history. And individuals are definitively redeemed by the grace of God and the imputation of Christ's righteousness to them judicially. And then having had the righteousness of Christ imputed to them judicially by God, they then begin to work out their salvation with fear and trembling, to use the language of Paul. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's our goal as individuals. And Christians will say, yes, yes, I believe that. I'm better now than when I was converted. I have conformed myself to the law of God ethically, and God has blessed me because of it. And when I die at 70 or 80, I'm supposed to be a more consistent, more successful Christian than I was when I was converted at the age of whatever. And people say, yes, I believe that. I believe that. Well, how about the church? Yes, sir, the church is going to be redeemed progressively, sanctified. The church will get better. The creeds will get better. Education will get better. Okay, how about the family? Can the Christian family be redeemed progressively? Yes, they say. Somebody who is married in the first year is certainly judicially married, and he will be no more married when he celebrates his 50th wedding anniversary. They're equally married, but shouldn't there be progress in the marriage? Shouldn't the family unit be a more consistent witness to the redemption of Jesus Christ in history? And most Christians will say, amen, brother. And then we say, and now let's talk about the state. And all of a sudden, we don't talk about the state. Well, why can't it be redeemed? We don't talk about the state. It can't be redeemed. Individuals can be redeemed, and families can be redeemed, and churches can be redeemed, but not the state. In other words, that view of history says that the kingdom of God does not operate in a progressive way in the area of civil government, even though it does in the other realms. And then I say, could you make an exegetical case for that? Will you show me the Bible verses that prove that we can have progressive sanctification individually, familistically, ecclesiastically, but not in the area of civil government? The other man has to make that case. That case isn't intuitive in terms of what the Bible teaches about progressive sanctification in history.
Ministry is always personal, and ministry is always from person to person. But the remarkable thing is that our covenant God intends for those interpersonal interactions to actually have culture-wide implications. So when a person is converted in a land, it starts a ripple effect throughout the entire land. It begins to change the whole land. What we're seeing right now, for instance, in Iran and Iraq, among the Kurds and the Yazidis, is a tremendous outpouring of conversion and discipleship that is transforming the whole face of the Middle East. It is terrifying the leadership of countries like Turkey and Syria, and it's causing a tremendous amount of displacement as the powers and the principalities try to snuff out the gospel. I'm convinced that the persecution of the church in China came because the communist leadership in China realized that there were culture-wide implications, a kind of tipping point that was occurring because of the rapid growth of the church in China. Individuals were being converted, but it was changing families, and then changing commercial relationships, and then changing whole communities, and then changing whole regions. And what they were seeing was the discipling of an entire nation. The communist leadership think that they can stamp it out through severe persecution, by tearing down churches and by imprisoning leaders. What they don't realize is that there is a pandemic far more fearsome to the communist ideology than anything that ever came out of Wuhan. And it's the gospel of Jesus Christ as it spreads from border to border all across China. The discipling of nations occurs in this multi-tiered covenantal fashion. That's why you actually have mixed pronouns in Matthew's account of the Great Commission. The idea there is that you go from first person to second person to third person. It's an expansion that is woven even into the grammar of the Great Commission. It's talking about the gospel going to individuals that then take it to the entire nation.
In Psalm chapter 2, the Father says to the Son, Ask of me and I'll give you the nations for your inheritance, the very ends of the earth for your possession. And then he says to the kings of the earth to be wise and to obey the Son, or you'll perish. So here we have the declaration from the Father that the rulers of this world are called to obey Jesus. And so when we talk about, why speak to these issues, well, there's a very simple response. Because Jesus has all authority over everything. He has authority over the President of the United States of America today. He has authority over my governor. He has authority over my city council. The decisions that they're making in terms of legislation, God has something to say about that. Jesus is the ruler, and he will establish justice in the earth. And so the call of the Christian church is to proclaim the good news of his kingdom and his salvation, and to tell the world to come and obey the Son, come and submit to him. With the Apostle Paul, we would all, I think, grant that the Apostle Paul, through divine inspiration, knows the story that we're supposed to be telling. And in Romans, his systematic explanation of the good news, he starts and he ends this letter saying that the purpose is to bring about the obedience of faith, or the obedience that comes from faith among all the nations for the sake of his name. And he ends with that same proclamation that the goal of this Christian mission is to bring about the obedience of the nations. Does that involve government? Does that involve Christian businesses? Does that involve Christian education? Does that involve all of life? It encompasses everything.
When the state is not restrained by a law greater than itself, it will become a law unto itself. While ever there is no throne above the government, they will assume the highest authority over us. You know what the greatest threat to tyranny is? The greatest threat to tyranny is a group of people who pledge their allegiance to someone higher than the government. People who pledge their allegiance to something other than a prime minister, or a state premier, or a politician. So today, we need to remind our politicians that we are not their property. We are not the property of the state. That God, not the government, own us. That Christ, not Caesar, owns the people. And that Scripture, not the government, not the state, dictate how they behave.
Look. The Christian gatekeepers are dead. It's over. Okay, and COVID just helped it. COVID just said, okay, who's really spineless? And you can argue, yeah, but they write good things and they look really good on paper. Oh, they won't even go to church. Oh, you're done. You're done.
I think we're seeing a shaking of the institutions in Australia. I think we are largely a trusting people. We think the best of everyone. We think the best of the institutions, and we've almost had a blind faith in the institutions, in the medical institutions, education, in the government, state governments, the federal government. We've had a blind trust in these things. But that includes the church as an institution as well. And what we've seen is a shaking of the church. And a lot of the things, the worthless things that we've accumulated to ourselves are shaken. And the shaking is what has exposed them for what they are. It's exposed our weaknesses. But when they come down, we are required to replace that. It's imperative that we replace that with something that can't be shaken, with truth that is eternal. And I think, well, it's my hope that in the coming years we are going to see new ministers stand up for the truth, for what's right, and those men who take courageous stands will inspire more men to take courageous stands. And if that's not the case, there's not a lot of hope for the church in Australia. We are irrelevant already, and we will fade out into irrelevancy if that does not happen.
The church, first and foremost, that's our first focus, is absolutely entering into increased persecution, and that's not just specific to the American evangelical church, but churches around the world. America is still, there is absolutely persecution and tyranny taking place and ramping up, but it's relatively light compared to not just somewhere like China, but even other Western nations like Canada, even Australia. There are other places that you never would have thought, just even a year and a half ago, you never would have thought that, Australia would become a police state. And it is. I mean, it's this Orwellian, it's crazy what's happening. So the church needs to remember that the blood of the martyrs is the seedbed for the church. And so one of the ways that we win is by not surrender and not even by losing, but through suffering. And there is a difference. We don't win by losing. That's a contradiction. It's a logical fallacy, inconsistency. We don't win by losing, but we do win through suffering. And so I think the church needs to take heart and seek to suffer well where God has clearly, providentially called us to suffer. And that's another, the church needs to have discernment. Where has God revealed to us by way of providence that we are in fact called to suffer? And where is our suffering, other areas of suffering, self-inflicted? Because there are some ways in which we're suffering where we have alternatives, God-honoring, obedient, biblical alternatives. Paul doesn't just sit there and take a flogging. He appeals to his Roman citizenship. Says, you're not allowed to do this. It's not rightful. So Paul is not a sadist who enjoy, and I think sometimes Christians enjoy losing. I don't know, it's this warped view of suffering. I think it's a wrong-headed misinterpretation of the gospel and the suffering that Christ endured. Even the cross, like I've often, the Bible doesn't say, for the joy of crucifixion, he endured the cross. That's insane. No, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, the shame. He despised the shame. So what was the joy? It's not for the joy of suffering he suffered. It was for another joy he was willing to suffer in order to achieve something else. And so Christians need to be willing to suffer where we must. Even Jesus, he prayed in the garden before his arrest. If possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. I think that if Christians were willing to be courageous and willing to fight, there are a lot of cups that the Lord would have allowed to pass from us. I think it's important that we remember what's promised, what's ultimately promised is that the church will win, and that's because Christ wins. And it's not just Christ winning despite the church and then pulling the church up with him after his victory, but no, Christ winning through the church. So that's important for us to recognize. The church is going to win. What's not promised is that America will win. What's not promised is that Canada will win, or that Australia will win, meaning that empires, human empires, come and go. On average, with just a little bit of study through a history of empires on average, the best of empires, tend to last about 250 years. So America's right there. And if America falls, that has no bearing on my post-mill eschatology. Because America falling or America enduring is not what Scripture promises. What's promised is that the church will endure, that Christ's empire, through his church, through his body, that will not fall, that will continue to expand. It won't just survive, but it will thrive, it will expand, it will grow. And so I think it's important that Christians fight for America, that they fight to preserve blessings from God, but knowing that these things are not promised, and if they fall, it has no bearing on God's promise for the church to endure.
And I have seen, and this is a good thing, many Christians have awakened that would not otherwise have taken a strong stand and have said, we're not going to give up our country this easily. We're not going to give up the faith this easily. We're going to stand for our culture. As a result, I see a great conflict coming. How will that conflict will end? Well, I know ultimately it will end. We're going to win. We're the victors, and Christianity will cover the earth. Christian culture will be a thing in every single nation in the world. Will be Christianized, not perfect, of course, but Christianized before the second advent. In the short term, I think there's coming a great conflict. I think even more intense conflict than we've seen before, and that's a good thing, because I think that even though the wicked are going to become fiercer and more hostile, I think Christians are going to become more zealous, more uncompromising in their faith. What will that conflict look like? Will it mean some Christians going to jail? Well, they're already going to jail in Canada over resisting COVID lockdown, church COVID lockdown orders. Will it mean a number of new Christian schools and hundreds of thousands of parents homeschooling their children? Yes, I mean, that's happening now, but even more, yeah, that's happening. But I think more and more Christians are getting serious about their faith, and I think that's a good thing. The coming conflict is a good thing. God's called us to that conflict. We shouldn't be unkind about it. We shouldn't be cruel. We shouldn't be vindictive, but we should stand firm and oppose evil everywhere we see it. And in so doing, we honor and glorify God.
What I honestly am most focused upon right now, in light of what's going on in the world, is if there is a deep valley in front of us, I need to understand why it's there. In other words, as I look at the history of the church, I cannot identify a greater enemy to the claims of Christ than secular claims, and the secular system that is now globally in power. I mean, think about what it says. Not only is there no creator, there is no purpose, no transcendent meaning. Everything is random. If an asteroid hit the planet today, the universe could care less. There is no beauty. There is no reason for redemption. There is no love, because love is just simply the fizzing of chemicals in your brain. Secularism is the utter denial of the goodness of God and everything that Christ taught. There have been great enemies in the past, but they were never an exhaustive, fundamental denial of every element of the Christian message that secularism is. And so when I think about Christ subjecting every enemy under his feet, and I see how that's happened in church history, I see the positive things that has brought about, but now we're facing this. I simply ask myself the question, if Christ is going to subjugate this enemy, is it going to be something that is done suddenly? Is it going to be something that is done by some sudden supernatural destruction of all of his enemies and that stuff? Well, that's not how he's been doing things through church history. He has subjugated enemies to himself over time in a God-glorifying fashion that required his people to show patience and Christ-likeness for long periods of time. And so I look at secularism, and at least now Christians are really seeing it for what it is, because they see what it results in. We don't know what a boy or a girl is anymore. And so my question becomes, if it is his intention to defeat this, might that take some time? Might there be suffering? I mean, again, I'm a historian. I sit back and I go, for 70 years, the Lord allowed communism to reign supreme in the Soviet Union, and Christians suffered grievously under that. What was the purpose? what is the end result of this? And if the West is now foolish enough to go the same direction, 120 million people killed in one century, let's see if we can triple it. If we're so foolish to go that way, is it possible that not only will the church be purified in the process of suffering, but this system cannot stand? That if you cannot tell the difference between boys and girls, your culture will collapse. This system is going to go down. It's going to go down with a huge explosion. And so could this not be a situation where for generations and generations to come, you look back and never again does secularism raise its ugly head amongst the tribes of men, because we all look back and say, look what happened. See what it did. This is the greatest example of our learning our lesson. If there is a time of trouble that we are going into, because the technology that now exists, could you imagine what the Soviets could have done if they had drones and satellites and the ability to basically observe everyone at all time? Would have been a whole lot harder for freedom to have broken out in situations like that. If that's what we're going into, then what am I called to do? How am I called to endure? How am I called to be patient? How am I called to be joyful in the midst of all this? And again, if I have an eschatology that's basically saying, this is it, we lose down here, I'm not going to be trying to do anything to promulgate that truth and to push that truth forward into the next generations. I'm not going to be preparing my grandkids to be a small minority if that's what they're called to be in their particular culture for a period of time. For me, this is where I'm really focused right now in regards to my joy personally and my encouragement to fellow believers is not saying, oh no, everything's just gonna get better and better and better and there's never, because that's not what has happened. God has judged many nations and cultures over the course of the past 2,000 years. And we have no reason, as we look at the blood on our hands, at the fact that we have spit in God's face in light of all the things He's revealed to us and the blessings He's given to us, the light that He's given to us, we have absolutely no basis for saying that God's just going to continue to pour out financial blessings and military blessings and blessings of ease of life and food and so on and so forth. Postmillennialism says that Christ is ruling and reigning, and we are called to proclaim His lordship because He has all authority in heaven and earth. And so if that's true, there is a responsibility on our part in our lives to speak prophetically to those around us as to what the very foundation of judgment is going to be, and then to be thinking in a forward manner, thinking about what's going to be coming, thinking about laying the foundation for the next generation, the generation after that. And that to me is exciting. It's challenging because there's no escape hatch. It's continued faithfulness.
Well, we'll be all right if the Lord be on our side. We'll be all right if the Lord be on our side. We'll be all right if the Lord be on our side. And the Lord, He's on our side. And we all belong to Jerusalem above. We all belong to Jerusalem above. We all belong to Jerusalem above. And we sail for Eden's shore.
How do the idols fall? How are the giants in the land defeated? What is the fate of those united in opposition to the Lord and to His Christ? The people of God have faced some formidable enemies down through the centuries, but we're still here. To paraphrase Ben Merkle, you may not be postmillennial, but the progressives certainly are. They have a vision for this world. They have a plan for our children and for the future of our nations. Unfortunately for them, Christ has been given the nations as his inheritance, and he reigns from his heavenly throne today. He cannot be overthrown, he cannot be ignored, and he will not be thwarted in his plan to conquer this world by the power of the gospel. That's where you come in. Christ has chosen you and me to be his hands and feet, to be the resistance, to take every thought captive in this world until the knowledge of the Lord fills the earth as the waters cover the sea. Sure, it's a daunting task, but it is accomplished slowly but surely. One by one, the idols are toppled. One by one, the enemies of Christ are defeated. These are our marching orders. This is how the meek inherit the earth.
For Eden's shores, and we sail for Eden's shores. Fret not thyself at evil men, nor envy those who work it wrong, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the new cutter. But worketh good and trust the Lord, and make your dwelling in the land. Make faithfulness a trusty friend, and verily you will be
Out there. Shooting a bit, we'll see what happens. Like over there, maybe.
Delight thyself in God, he'll give all thy desires of heart to thee. Unto the Lord commit your way, and he will act without delay.
Every person has his own sphere of influence. Every person, if a parent, children. If a wife, husband, probably children. If you're single, you have friends. And those around you. Influence everybody around you for the truth of Christianity. A comprehensive, global, world-conquering, gospel-drenched, and by that I mean the gospel in all of its fullness, Christianity. Stress the importance of individual self-government, individual responsibility, not pushing responsibilities off on the state, but taking full responsibility. I would also say, as you're able, generate wealth so that you can support a family and support Christian works and the kingdom of God. Stand for Jesus Christ at all costs. I'd like to say this about influence. This is very important. We have much less control than we think we have, and we have much greater influence than we think we have. Even those of us that feel that we have almost no influence have more influence than we think. Just a word of encouragement to people will help. Good example of this, I believe, is in standing for the truth. All of us know situations in which we see a grave injustice going on, somebody violating God's law. And there are a few timid Christian souls around. They're thinking, well, boy, we're in the minority, and I don't know, should we say anything? We don't know. This is bad. We wouldn't participate in it, but maybe we should just pull off to the sideline. And then one Christian has the courage to say, I'm going to stand up against this. This is wrong. I'm not going to support it, and we need to oppose it. And all of those timid ones around, many of them at least, will say, yes, that's right. They were just waiting, Nathan, for one person to stand up. That's all they needed. Well, let's each of us determine that we'll be that one person to influence those around us to stand for the faith, no matter what the cost.
Amen, brother.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome very much.
This was great.
Hope you can use some of that.
Oh, most